All right. Well, today we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of our Wear OS program, which I am steadily working on, I had to take a few steps backwards and uh, find out some more about Kotlin and Android development so that I could appropriately have a tile that can launch another application. And I've gone through and built a few small like tutorial applications. I'm starting to understand class instantiation. Of course, it's not that hard. I just didn't know how to do it and get the nomenclature or the right words there in the code. So we'll come back to that. That's certainly not done at all. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the other thing that I do and that I have far more knowledge on than Android and Wear OS development is data quality. Particularly, we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about the data quality dimensions. And, one might ask, why focus on data quality? And, in any data driven culture, data driven environment today, the number one thing you'll hear people talking about is I can't make the right decisions because of the quality of the data. And at some point, it gets used as a crutch or an excuse as to why they can't deliver. But otherwise, other times, there are real problems with the data, and it's an ongoing effort to maintain. It's certainly not a one and done kind of process. There's a few ways you can think about data quality. Obviously, there's the IS or kind of tech way, and those really, to me, become more like the ABCs, sort of audit, balance, and controls, especially around data movement and whether or not you've got a certain amount of records from a change data capture, or maybe there's external data that you're ingesting in, and you need to know that you had X number of records and you loaded Y number of records, and if there's a deviation in that, your stakeholders need to know about it. If you don't have that built in today, that's something to advocate for. You'd be surprised at some of the companies I've worked at and the size of those companies who didn't have controls or quality measures installed from that baseline. Of course, you can always look at data quality from the governance perspective, either in the data stewardship realm or data quality within governance. It's sort of baked into that, and you can then concern yourself with data quality metrics and indexes and percentages and KPIs. Uh, but I'm currently more concerned with data quality from the business perspective. You're an analyst, you're a data scientist. How do you monitor? How do you double check? How do you ensure that the product that you're producing, has the quality that it requires, that you can stand behind it and tell the people that you're delivering that to that you feel confident in that data. So, so another riveting topic. I enjoy it because it's got a lot of sleuthing, root cause analysis, trying to figure out what went wrong and why, interacting with lots of different departments and business folks as well as tech folks, getting to do a little bit of coding, getting to do at least a lot of SQL for me, but I enjoy doing that. And you can certainly use Python scripts to execute your SQL. A lot of times I'll write a SQL statement and then connect via ODBC, either using Tableau or Power BI, and then you can create a nice visualization. You can essentially create a little dashboard and ship that around if people want to see it. I do that a lot with funnels. So anyway, let's go forward here. So varying textbooks, varying theoretical constructs will talk about how many data quality dimensions there are. I think that a lot of times we tend to focus on some of the more esoteric ones and start with the more challenging ones and not just the fundamentals. And the fundamentals will burn you every time. So it's good to have control over them. So let's get started. First data quality dimension we're going to talk about is timeliness. You can also hear it talked about as currency, like data currency, or maybe data decay. I always like data decay, but I find that the business folks don't appreciate that at all. Um, And some people separate these into multiple data quality dimensions, and I tend to lump them in together. And the way I define this first dimension is really the most basic one is the data there. And do I receive notifications? And if you receive them, or are there defined service level agreements from whoever's producing that data and making it available to you? Typically, if you're in an analytics space or a business user, you're not querying the source system, and if you are, stop doing that. It just impacts the customers, and you want to get yourself data repository that you can use and that you can bang up against without any care as to whether your statement is a big turd of a SQL statement. Because a lot of data quality ones are really not looking for performance here. Can't tell you how many times you're doing some convoluted statement with a bunch of likes and group buys and whatnot just to try to get to the root cause of the issue. But uh, really, this is the most important one to me, is saying, is the data current? So if I have a customer table or a sales table, and usually all of those tables have date time stamps, get familiar with those and make sure that if they're supposed to be loaded every night in a batch, or maybe it's real-time streaming, that there is current data there. And if you're in the middle space and you're not in the business per se, but maybe you're responsible for the maintenance of any of these repositories, how embarrassing is it to have the business come back to you and say, I don't think the customer table has been updated for about 3 or 4 days. Can you look into that? To me, those are fundamentals you should really just have a handle on. If you don't feel bad. Half the places I've been at don't have a handle on this most basic of one. You can take it a step farther too, especially if you ingest a lot of external data. And the fact that, then you need to start looking at, okay, we know that the data is coming in. Maybe you get 200 files a day that you're processing into a customer database or online orders, whatever that is. Do you expect to have orders from X company if they're a customer of yours and you haven't received any orders for them for a week? Is that unusual? And you can start to look at some of those things as well, just to make sure that, if you've got 500 customers out there, what's that data decay look like from your customers? And that starts to push us into the last slide, one of the last slides we're going to talk about, which is contextual data quality, of really trying to marry these fundamentals and the business use cases that are out there. But regardless, this one is something that's usually pretty easy to do, at least on a cover your backside kind of basis, and we'll leverage the database system tables for this. And or you could also use max load dates, things like that. But we'll play around with this one in SQL. I think there's some interesting ways. And probably we'll use BigQuery for this. That's what I'm currently using. You could, if you've got an on-prem system, Oracle or SQL Server will work as well. Most all of this SQL is pretty ambidextrous. There's always some items that you're going to have to change. Coalesce doesn't exist in BigQuery. You need to use null if or if null. Different things like that. But those are things you can Google. The fundamentals and the logic behind this is all going to be the same. So the next data quality dimension is completeness. Really, this is talking about is the data there to support what you need. If you're working on an email campaign and you're expecting that you have email addresses for all of your suppliers or your customers, and if you've only got half of them, well, you're up the river. And another part of that is what about middle initial? No one cares about middle initial. I can't imagine. I can't remember a time when anyone cared about that. So it's sort of contextual as well. I tend to drive this more off of critical data elements, that those items that are most important for either a particular use case, or maybe you work in identity management, and date of birth, name and address are critical. Phone is critical. Email is nice to have. So really focusing and honing in on what those critical data fields are. If you're um, working on dollar amounts, and it's critical that you've got those amounts. So being able to identify that, and you can do that through data profiling, you can do that through critical data elements. This also speaks in my mind to the next topic, which is consistency. And this is really talking about data movement. So every time you move the data from one place to another, there's an opportunity to fall down. And so one, reducing the opportunities to fall down is key. You should move the data as little as possible, because every time you move it, you're either streaming it, you're either got a batch process, a job, you've got something that can fail and that will fail. You typically have notifications that will fail, and they'll be right back in the first one is, why don't I have my data? Oh yeah, that job bombed out on Monday, and it's Friday afternoon at 4 and everybody's leaving. You're wondering why you can't produce that report. You promised to be there by Friday afternoon, and now you're the one who's stressed out. So we can track, pretty easily. At least you can look at making sure that from a key level that you have the distinct counts from data from one system to another. Of course, you have to have access to those systems, but I'll show you a couple little tricks on how to compare if you have a source system and a staging layer and then your repository, how are you going to compare the data from one to another? You might have a NoSQL system, you may have uh, a full-on database, or you might just have a bunch of tables with some keys in there and they call it a database, or a data warehouse, which it's certainly not. But you can see from the wrinkles on my face and the no hair on my head that I'm pretty older. I'm from the older generation. I tend to like me some on-prem data warehouses. I think the cloud stuff is pretty cool, but a lot of the cloud stuff just shifts the burden from one place to another for who's responsible for taking care of whether or not you have the quality of data that you need. So those are just my opinions, and they're worthless. So we'll move on from consistency to accuracy, accuracy, validity, and precision. This is really all about if the data elements are as expected. If you're in an on-prem system that is, like an Oracle database or data warehouse, or even in the cloud, if you're, got defined tables and you're not just living in a world of JSON records, then you're typically not going to have text fields and things that are defined as integers, and if they're actually defined that way, then you just won't have that. So it's really not a huge issue. Missing data and null data is a bigger issue, and reference data is here. RDM, reference data management. So if you have an MDM system or an RDM system, is the data there current? Is it reliable? That stuff can get out of date relatively quickly, especially in the healthcare industry. If you work there and you're looking at procedure codes or SNOMED codes or NDC codes, and any of the drug type codes, that really needs to be something that you keep an eye on. In general, I like to do this with data profiling. This is this is another place where some of the tools come into play. Some of the tools will profile automatically for you, even create some somewhat helpful indexing around the quality of that particular field based on the profiling. I'll show you how to do data profiling on pretty much any table that you have. It's a kind of a neat little trick, and if you're an SQL wizard, then good for you. You probably don't want to watch my stuff. I'm no wizard. Just figured out how to do stuff over the years that works for me. And but you can use an execute immediate statement in SQL and essentially use SQL to write SQL, and it works really well for data profiling. So you don't have to hand type all of that. And I'll show you a couple of examples where 5 lines of a SQL statement will turn into 300-400 lines of code that you wouldn't wish that on anyone to have to do. So starting to ramble. Apologies. Go forward here. Integrity. So these start to get more challenging as we go up, and depending on how your repository is set up, this is either something that's a non-issue, or it becomes more of an issue when you're in the cloud ecosystem, especially if you have just a collection of tables and you have a primary key-ish and you have foreign keys within other tables that allow you to join back to make those meaningful use case type data sets that you need in order to do analytics. Uh, but we need to make sure, do we have the right parent-child relationships? Do we have orphan children? Do we have parents that don't have children that should? So all of this is stuff that can and should be done. It dabbles around in the gray area again, where you need to understand some of the context within the data and within the business in order to know whether your findings are appropriate or not. But it's still good to know them. It's good to know if you have a parent-child table and you've got tons of children that are missing parents. Why is that? Where does that problem come from? That really shouldn't be the case. And if you've got justifications for it, then I think it's a time to look at your process a little bit and determine, one, are we storing the data correctly then? And two, should we tighten up some of these processes so that we can eliminate some of the silly Sally stuff like that? So it just causes problems. And um, the other one is duplication. Hopefully that's in here. Accessibility, representation, and lineage. I don't think duplication is in here. I think I totally forgot duplication. Wow. Anyway, we'll talk about that anyway, and I'll add a slide to that book and then post it out there. So accessibility, representation, lineage, this is really all about documentation. And if you're lucky enough to work somewhere or be responsible for a place that has great documentation, then hats off to you. Hopefully you have some source to target mapping, maybe some transformation and business rules in there. If you don't, it's a good thing to create depending on where you sit in the organization. If you're in the tech space, you should be responsible for creating those models at some level. Maybe you've got a data architect that creates an Irwin model that shows the relationships of the tables. Those are pretty key for the work that we do of understanding how data relationships are supposed to work. Whether or not they actually work that way, that's some of the stuff that we're going to find out via the data quality process we're talking about. If you're in an organization that has a full-on data governance team, and you probably, hopefully, you're going to see a business glossary, you're going to see data lineage, you're going to see business rules, hopefully data quality rules, you're going to see KPIs and metrics, but every organization is in a different phase of this, and so don't be surprised if you're in a top dog company and you think they do an abysmal job of this, and look at it as an opportunity. All of these things that I'm talking about here, you can do as a data analyst or a business analyst, and it really can become a value statement, and it helps you learn so much about the data, and it helps you learn about the next slide, which is contextual. This is the hardest one to get at because you've got to have that business knowledge to know really what matters around for data quality. And there are lots of gotchas for newbies here. You stumble all the time. If you think you found a problem, you think you found a solution, you think you've got to find, and you're like, oh yeah, that's just the way the data is. And so it's really about how quality is defined by the customer that you work for. And maybe you are the customer, and so you're defining that. And then this becomes key for you to define when should I raise the red flags. But a lot of times I see this as the starting point of data quality. And so we go through an elaborate process of creating dashboards or metrics on this contextual data quality, and we still get burned by, did we get the data? Did we load the data? Do we have duplicates? And I think that's the one I didn't add in here like an idiot, duplication. Again, depending on what kind of system you have, duplication might not be an issue. In a defined data warehouse, be it an Inman or type Kimball model, duplication is actually pretty rare because you're either going to add or you're going to update data more than likely. And if you match on the keys, you're going to update that data. If you don't match on the keys, you're going to add that data. It's a little more tricky when you start streaming data off of Kafka pipes, when you start moving data in the cloud. I deal a lot of duplication. I find records upon records that are virtually identical, except for the date timestamp. And then we have to go through the whole process of a root cause analysis. Why this happened? Is it really a duplicate? So that becomes one of those thorns in your side that you want to eliminate as quickly as possible from problems. And the goal of getting a repeatable process and even one with alerts on some of these fundamentals is then you can focus on one, being one step ahead of the game. You know about a problem before there's a problem, or two, you can focus, and two, I guess you can focus on these more value-driven data quality topics. So I think that's pushing us here. Oh, we're already at 20 minutes. Wow. What's next? So really, I think we're going to go through each of these, and we'll implement some basic SQL around them that can be automated, or you can dump into a data quality dashboard. I typically like to work to automate them, so the SQL we'll write will give us like the full meal deal, but the automated alert SQL is really just show me those outliers. I want to be told if there's a problem and not have to spend my life looking at dashboards or running SQL statements every single morning. You still end up doing that, but at least hopefully makes yourself feel a little bit better that somehow you maybe automated something. And then finally here, I think it'd be good to talk a little bit about, you're new to an organization and, you're in a data quality or an analytics position. What does that 30, 60, 90-day look like? Or what's a version of that you might be able to leverage and take a few things out of? And really it's to drive a value statement. I mean, we're all aware of all the layoffs happening right now in tech, and not that having a clear value statement is necessarily going to save you, but I think it's good to be able to articulate your value statement of, why are you employed? Why do they continue to, write that check for you so that you can pay your bills? And you should be able to clearly articulate that statement and work that into status reports or performance reports so that, if you can't articulate it, then how do you expect anybody else to do it accurately? So talk a little bit about that. I think that's a big thing that I've tried to do over the years is make sure that I clearly understand what is the value I'm bringing to the organization, and not for a go-go team, kind of deal, but more self-preservation and self-growth, I guess, is more probably what you would look at it as. Is you can be honest with yourself and say, what is it that I'm contributing here? And if it's not much, then how do you change that? And, one of the things I would suggest is that, carving yourself out a position as, the data quality guru, especially if you're on the analytics side or more towards the business, that it's not necessarily super sexy, but it's got a lot of value. And, show me a place that says our data quality is awesome and we don't need to monitor it, and I'll show you a liar. So that's it for today. Hopefully this came through okay, because I plan on doing no editing as usual, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.